name's Julian, he pronouns. Matthew, he him pronouns.
Awesome, start affirmative.
Hi, I'm Anna, first affirmative, my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, Jess, second half, she, her.
Hi, Brendan, third half, he, him.
First name Tetsushi, he, they.
Second name Gypsy, she, her. Third name Jordyn, she, they. Sorry,
Awesome. So just a note on timing, 8 minutes and 15 seconds, 1 at 6, 2 at 8, and then just a continuous at 8:15. So whenever the speaker is ready on the motion that the prestigious entertainment industry awards should have an entirely transparent decision-making process, I'd like to welcome the first affirmative speaker. Is it recording?
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much.
The film about Malcolm X was widely regarded as one of the best films of that year, let alone of all time, yet it never received a single accolade. Our contention is it's in part due to this untransparent process, and we fix this on our side. Starting on setup though, what does the topic, a status quo look like? Obviously the topic slide suggests that there's no concrete info, there's a pool of people who are involved in the decision-making process where they vote or rank, yet and these people are well-known insiders, likely to be producers, big-name actors, costume designers, marketers, these things. But the discussions that they have, there's no records of that, it's completely in the dark, and even the individuals, members themselves, aren't disclosed. However, we would also just like to point out that there's obviously industry talk, such that there are like rumors about standards and things like that, but there's also been like a recent trend in journalism where you have anonymous people involved in this process being asked questions, and it has emerged from this that there is some sort of idea that these people really never have had to disclose or justify their decisions. On the alternative, what we would support is something of the model of the British Film Institute in their Sight and Sound polls, where in this model, every 10 years you have like a poll where you ask filmmakers, critics, writers, this large pool of people to each provide their own like top films or top media, and then you sort through this process together. Obviously it wouldn't be every 10 years, it would be every year for most of these processes, but the key important thing here is that these lists are published, one, but also the critics themselves are provided such that they are asked questions, they are sometimes expected to provide explainers and things like that. This makes the process clear and public, and it's a burden on the negative team to explain why something of the status quo or another non-transparent model would be beneficial, or more beneficial than our proposition. Now moving on to why these awards are important in themselves, and I'm starting here because if we do prove that they're important, it creates an imperative for people to know how these awards are apportioned. We would say they're important within two domains. Firstly, within the film industry, people in the industry, including production companies, really care about this stuff because it is a determinant of status and prestige, which is obviously really important with these industries. These awards themselves structure social status or your status within the industry, and we would also contend that this includes not only big name actors, but also the costume designers, the sound editors, more of the like working, I guess, class people within this industry. But secondly, it's really important for those personally who are like striving towards these awards. Often this is a capstone of a really long career of hard work. The film industry is quite exploitative because you're allowed to use your passion as justification, or it's like really competitive, meaning that it really does matter a lot for the people within the industry. Outside of the industry though, it's important for two reasons. Firstly, these awards are crucial for increasing the status of films among people, but it also tells people, it's a signalling mechanism that allows people to understand what is artistically valuable. There is a discursive effect there that is really important to society. This is all to say that this is really important, and people should know how they are apportioned, and this creates a burden onto the negative team to explain why something so important should be hidden behind closed doors. But it also allows us to prove that if it is undemocratic or like unmeritocratic or discriminative, this impact is really large because of this importance. Now moving on to my second piece of substantive, which is why this is done badly in the status quo and why it is fixed on our side. We would say that obviously the person who votes is well known within the industry, they have created reputation and have a high standing. These aren't random people and they're not film critics. This has a few implications. Firstly, obviously, because it takes time to build reputation, these people are often older, it takes time to build expertise, and this has a few implications in terms of how the media is weighed in this decision processes. For 6 implications here. Firstly, people often evaluate in respect to their own experience and their own career. They often evaluate media in terms of their own achievements because that is what they're referencing, the like standard of reference. But secondly, they often allow their own personal intuitions, understandings of social dynamics within this industry to impact their decision. They might think that someone is probably deserving of this accolade even though the film itself isn't of a high value. Secondly, as I flagged, these people are often older, meaning statistically they're likely to be more conservative, more and white people. And a really good example of this is a recent Entertainment Weekly article which interviewed 4 anonymous Academy voters, and one of them was an old white actor who was explicitly racist, saying that these awards are captured by wokeism and this wasn't good. Thirdly, though, these people often become swept up in trends. Another example from the same article is a person who believed that because the director of a particular movie was black, you needed to award this movie with awards, even though the film wasn't entirely deserving of this. This obviously means that it's not merit-based, but secondly, it explains why there's no reason why this shouldn't have been explained to the public. Fourthly, though, people just don't pay attention. It's an open secret within Hollywood that people don't even watch all of the films and evaluate them accordingly. And there's no imperative to do so. Fifthly, people vote on questions that they're not equipped to vote on. Examples are actors having to weigh in on decisions about sound media and sound production. Obviously, these people sometimes aren't well equipped to do so, and we would note specifically that you often exclude film critics and things who are locked out of these processes, who would probably be better equipped to do so because it is their literal job. And sixthly, these processes are beholden to randomness. Another example from the same article was that people dismissed a film because it felt like a commercial and there was no further justification. Even if this was a legitimate take on this film, these people felt no need to justify, such that you had more of ability to be taken hold by randomness. We would note that this means that 1, this is not merit-based, but 2, you never have to justify your decisions, such that there is 3, no accountability, meaning that the implication of all of this is threefold. You have 1, people pandering to trends because it is more likely to do so if you don't have to justify it, but 3, you have people getting awards that are widely disagreed, that experts disagree with widely, and 3, as I noted, you just get random allocations of really, really important awards. On our side, we fix this. Note that we can't by fiat make sure that the pool of people are now really good. But we have 3 additional mechanisms that are exclusive to our side. 1, now voters who don't want scrutiny select out. There's a selection mechanism there. 2, people who do stay now know that they need to explain their decisions. They now need to actually watch all the films and have something intelligent to say. But 3, and really importantly, you have the ability for clear criteria to be established over time in terms of who is supposed to be selected onto these pools of people. You have the ability for this to be published and evaluated such that the pool becomes more diverse and you can simply prove that you're a good addition. Weigh this under the possible hypothesis that Nick can bring about how problematic trends in awards might occur. These are concrete things, especially because awards are unimportant and there's no accountability mechanisms whatsoever.
Awesome. I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech, and whenever the speaker is ready, I'd like to welcome the first speaker.
going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. You can easily imagine if the result of the number of streaming is the same as the result of the award, people will stop watching Grammy Awards, and people will stop watching Oscar Awards. We think that the purpose of these awards is to be unpopular or surprising or entertaining. That's why these awards exist. And we think that it is a unique benefit that we can protect by making it not so transparent to the public. So I'm gonna do 3 things in my speech. First, explain the purpose of award and explain why those awards have the incentive to create the competition. And 2, the mechanism, and explain how on their side of the house, some big companies would be dominant in the popular industry and why it's so bad. And lastly, I will explain why diversity is so important this day. First, the purpose of these awards. These awards are entertaining, like we can see in the status quo. For example, we can see the very fancy MCs, or we can see the people dressing beautifully in the awards. We think that those award shows are the sideshow in the current situation, and it makes people more motivated or interested in those music industry or movie industry right now. If there's no excitement, it just means that one, the decrease of the reputation or popularity from those awards from others. But second is that it's very difficult for those awards to get money from the public. I mean that they will try to rely on the private corporations or something like that. But second thing here is that how the process in the current situation look like. We think that it's completely undemocratic or not representative of the popular culture. There are full of professionals or people who really watch the movies. For example, we think that they have the incentive to make process controversial because as I said, because the result of the number of streaming, if it's the same as the result of the award, it's no meaning for that award. We think that that's why Everything Everywhere at Once, for example, or Parasite, or other minors, the movies from minor studios, were actually awarded in these awards. We think that on the other hand, on their side of the house, the box offices, the number of streamings will be adopted because it's just the only one way to justify this is the objectively admitted the good movie, right? I think that ordinary people who it's basically impossible to watch every film and justify their decision. So why is it so likely? We think first, the democratic vote is very dominant and it's very popular in the Western society, and we think that people are likely to support these kind of a democratic voting system in their side of the house. But secondly, in that situation, we think that big companies or studios can do many campaigns to actually manipulate and gamify the criteria in the public discussion of these films. For example, Oscars, we think that films with diverse studios are adopted right now. But outcome here is that on their side of the house, there's no surprising or meaningful the outcome from the awards, which does not really contribute to the outcome to the culture itself. But next thing that I want to point out here is why awards are so pro-competitive in the current situation. First, award shows people will lose interest of the people, lose interest of it's the people, if it's the same as the number of the streamings, for example. They never wants to make their award same as the other objective criteria, and they try to give more platforms to minor or artistically good the creations. And the second thing here is that they want to keep superiority, right? They want to say that they watch so many movies and we know, artistic value of these movies. That's why they have the incentive to pick up very niche, the movie, for example, and say that this actually has the artistic value. I mean that affirmative side have no mechanism why selection is why selection in the current situation is Western-centric. I don't think that's not so true. Then why some big companies would be dominant on their side of the house? First, they also dominates the distribution process of the movie. For example, Disney or Fox News are becoming integrated and they're starting to own their cinemas. And what they can do is that they can manipulate or they can artificially increase the box office sales of their own movies, for example. For example, they can allocate movies of other studios to the more inconvenient times, for example, late at night or noon, and so that they can artificially to change the number of views that they can get for their movies. In the status quo, I think there's no incentive for them to manipulate such things significantly. They can also get revenue by showing other studios' movies, and they can balance such things out. But on the other hand, on their side of the house, those have the huge capacity, also the incentive to manipulate by using their own cinemas, for example. Which means that the big companies control both production and also distribution and also marketing of those movies. But the second reason here is that the absence of foreign competitions. We think that the awards are a unique actor which actually to bring foreign cultures into more Western cultures, because the streaming services, streaming numbers and streaming services, it needs to get famous first in order to go up to in the ranking. But second is that the algorithm in those industries automatically shows Western kind of productions, which means that the foreign competition is unlikely to exist on their side of the house. The implication here is that one, the workers who work for those studios or work for those companies don't have many choices of employers. Which means that they're more unlikely to find the good, the working conditions, for example. They're unlikely to have the competition of such employers, which means that they're unlikely to have the best choice for themselves. I mean that it's also difficult to hire diverse actors. The reason why, the MQU was hired is because, for example, there are so many niche or minor studios entering into the movie studio, and I think that non-existence of diversity in such studio will actually decrease the possibility of hiring those diverse actors. But second implication here is that it's very difficult to improve the culture of the Western culture, for example, by adopting the new diverse views from the other popular cultures. We think that on the affirmative side of the house, the culturally dominated world with the Disney, for example, or other big companies is quite powerful. Lastly, why diversity then is so important? First thing is that the people from as many backgrounds as possible should enjoy those music industries or those productions. And I think that's a quite big benefit, that even if you are living in any areas, you can actually attach to the cultures as much as possible. But second thing is that it adds new techniques, for example, or it adds new the story in the cultures, which means that for example, the other minor studios can introduce new filming techniques, which basically improves the quality of the other films or other music, and I think that is net good. Note, their fiat is limited to transparency. They cannot model any particular model, and we just defend the status quo. We improve the wide dominant studio process of games of the gamification will occur on their side of the house, not on our side of the house. And that's why I'm very proud to propose.
Awesome. I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that speech, and whenever the speaker is ready, we'd like to welcome the second affirmative.
to debate put forth by the film team. The first is questioning the purpose of the award system. The second is how dominant companies are just going to overrun. And third, the question of diversity. So onto the first. They make three key pushes in this question. The first is that the purpose of the industry is to just like be unpopular and to be entertaining. And this leads to like bad ratings. I think the reason they have bad ratings is because these award ceremonies are so long, so boring, and all the same. They read names, they clap for people, they do a speech. How boring, right? This is the reason they're currently unpopular. They're going to basically become more entertaining by making the process more transparent, by making people actually be involved, thinking they have some way to be involved, by allowing them to actually understand how it works, rather than just reading out a name, clapping, and giving a speech. No one cares, super boring. Second push is they said it's going to be hard to get public money through a decrease in popularity. First off, there's only so many massive art diehard fans, right? There's only so many people who actually care lots about the art industry currently. It's more on our side where we make it transparent that we actually engage with more people. We don't care about them, like there's only so many that will engage with the nitty gritty, which means even if it was to be dramatic and popular as they claim it might be, still majority of our side is going to believe it's dramatic and popular because people, like majority just aren't really interested in the nitty gritty of how the committee team was formed or how the nomination process worked. It's more likely that, like basically the whole point is practically symmetric. Their final push is that the criteria is now only going to become based on streaming services, and I have three reasons why the criteria will be more than this. First, there's more to the process of art than just watching the film, right? There are so many steps you have to go through in order to make a good film. You have to have good techniques, you have to have engagement, all of these things which is more than just streaming. Secondly, they're likely to have experts on our side in the actual like nominations, in the committee picking these things. It means they're likely to consider films which have actually engaged in good use of like media techniques or art techniques or whatever it is, right? Rather than just the amount of people who've watched it. And thirdly, generally people just stream something because they like it, not necessarily because it engages in really good skills. It's on our side where we address the fact that these good skills need recognition and are going to be acknowledged on our side. On to the second question of the impact of dominant companies. So they said that this is like dominant companies are basically going to artificially generate views and practically monopolize without saying monopolize. It's so hard to monopolize a company, right? First off, there's restrictions on buying out all other companies. You can't just buy out every other media company, like, no, we're going to run it now, like, we're going to make sure you can only watch ours. This is really unlikely. Secondly, there is incentive for more interesting and new art to rise. Why this, like, the affirmative team, the negative team may claim it doesn't. I have three reasons why it would. The first is art is a competitive market, right? Two reasons. People want to watch, because people these companies want you to watch their film or want you to listen to their music. Hence, there's incentive to differentiate, to be different, and to get these people involved. Secondly, there's more to the industry than just winning an award, right? There's driving sales, there's having interest, having a following, all really important things which encourages people to come up with new interesting art and not monopolize. And thirdly, currently it's the interesting art which people talk about, it's the interesting art which gets acknowledgement, it's the interesting art which actually is engaged with. This is obviously really good. It encourages people to, it gives incentive to have interesting art and not just artificially generate views or dominate the distribution process, because there's always incentive for a new company to rise, a new company to take this opportunity and create really good art. Secondly, under this claim, they said that workers don't have employer choices because there isn't heaps of companies to choose from. This is kind of continuing off the fact that companies would monopolize. As I said, monopoly isn't likely to happen. Also, workers generally have more choice once they receive an Oscar. It's like they're likely to be paid more. They've already gone through all of these years of like low pay, pretty bad conditions. Now they have this recognition of receiving Oscar. On our side, they understand, like the general public understands, or even the companies understand how this Oscar was attained. And obviously this is super important in demonstrating how your skills are really good, negotiating better employer choices, and this is obviously good. onto their third push of diversity. They said that we can't adopt diverse views. I just want to reiterate what we told you at first about the older white kind of generation basically running the committee, running the choices. Obviously now they have incentive to be less racist, they have incentive to be more diverse, as the general public can actually see who's on the nomination team. It is on the untransparent side where you can't see who's forming these committees. You have no say or ability to say that this is like bad, because on our side we have social media where you can provide feedback, you can provide like you can have a say in this, right? It's on their side where you have no idea, it's just bad. Secondly, they said that diversity is important because it breeds new techniques. I don't really think this is true, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but yeah. Anyway, final push of why art would just like kind of all become the same and reverse engineer to fit the award. Two reasons why this isn't the case. Firstly, one of the biggest parts of the criteria is likely to be creativity. Two reasons why. People in general get bored of the same thing. It's why people are currently bored of these award systems in general, because no one likes listening to the same thing. This applies to the committee. They don't want to see the same thing. They don't want to listen to the same thing. Obviously, creativity is going to be a part of their criteria. Secondly, generally the entertainment comes from something new, from something exciting, from something different. This is all part of creativity. It's why they wouldn't reverse engineer to fit the same award. It's likely criteria would ensure for this anyway. Secondly, overthinking is bad. It often leads to harms, right? If people are just overthinking and trying to fit the criteria, it means they're not necessarily addressing the experience of art as a whole. They're not really fitting the purpose of creating something that people are going to enjoy, creating quality and enjoyment of this art. They're instead just trying to push for award art that's going to fit the same, that's going to win an award. As I already told you, there's more to art than just winning an award. Secondly, on just some preemptive stuff on why backlash of the committee wouldn't occur if the incorrect decision is made. Sure, it may occur on a small scale, but we're willing to make this trade-off if it means the industry is more accountable as a whole. 3 reasons why the backlash is likely to be quite marginal. Firstly, it encourages the committee to actually take care and actually show interest. It means they are going to watch all of the films we told you doesn't occur currently. It means they are going to be held accountable, they are going to do all of these steps to make sure they're making the right decision. It means the decision-making process is actually likely to engage with all aspects of the criteria. People are now given the criteria. You can't just ignore things as you're going to be held accountable for this. And thirdly, social media allows feedback to be given, allows better choices to be made as people are being held accountable. And this is obviously good. We're okay with some backlash if it means that the accountability as a whole is better. Proud to affirm. Woo!
I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for that speech, and whenever the speaker is ready, we'd like to welcome the second negative.
Everyone ready? It is blatantly untrue that the media industry is one that is hard to monopolise. Indeed, it is one that is already incredibly monopolised, and that we need to support small and indie artists and filmmakers and everything to combat places like Disney, to combat major music producers, to combat people who put a bunch of money into things like musicals. And that's why when we give you very clear ways that making this unanonymous, making this so that selectors are under significant pressure, and also in ways that are likely to be numericalized and able to be gamified by big companies that have more money and ability to do this. This absolutely destroys indie competition. This means that we get less of this representation and very clearly wins us the debate. 2 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to do a lot on just kind of characterization, talking about what this looks like, what we stand for, and providing a very clear defense of the status quo and why it's effective. And then I'm going to talk about competition and why they completely undermine it. On characterization, and I just want to take a minute to recognise kind of the absurdity of this team's model at First Affirmative. They're like, there's this one British film like thing that has this one thing that they do every 10 years where they maybe view like critics and like other stuff and get these lists and then they kind of chat about it and figure out who wins. Incredibly unclear what this actually looks like. Very unclear, and I do not think they have the fear to be able to, you know, like say that this is what like organisations like the Oscars are going to adopt. I think instead they just stand for an anonymised system, and then the way that looks like is up to debate, and we explain why that is likely to be a numerical one. And I just think that the reason this is incredibly unlikely is because, as they say, people want meritocracy, people want to be able to vote and feel as these things are representative, and not like they're just giving power to like the elites that they hate on, but also are still giving this power to because critics are still relatively elite, right, within the industry. But also, it is just so much easier, very unclear, you know, like how you're going to sift through everyone's like personal playlists who submits to this and like find who the candidates are and then like form that in a way, like are you going to vote upon it? All of that kind of stuff seems like a logistical nightmare to me. But I also just think that voting and that kind of thing is the most meritocratic way to go about it. It is the way that is likely to be best and easiest for like places like the Oscars, or if it's not voting, it's going to be things like looking at how well these things perform box office sales, how well they perform, you know, even in things like critical reviews and like what kind of numbers they're getting and stuff like that, in ways that are able to very clearly package down into what is into what you're, you know, applying them for, rather than kind of this big subjective thing. Obviously, if that is the characterization, they lose immediately because they can see that art is about more than numbers, more than numerical characterizations. They don't even attempt to defend this, so I think that that is a loss. But I'm going to engage with their model of like, you know, this being people, like a wider variety of kind of film-engaged people discussing it and why that's likely to be really harmful. The first thing is, I just think it is going to be logistically really difficult and really hard to get through. Like, just a real pain to do. There's probably a reason why this British one does every 10 years and not every year, multiple times a year. But additionally, I think that this board is likely to have all of the same bias issues that they pin on us. And that's to say that, like, note they're just incredibly uncomparative in this point. Yeah, sure, probably some of the actors and people who are on the boards under our side are relatively privileged. The entertainment industry is one of privilege. So too are film critics, so too are all the people who they would have making these decisions. It's unclear that it is any better, why they're any less, you know, conservative or problematic. But in fact, I think they are likely to be worse, and that is because anonymity is key to integrity. That's because you don't want to piss off big industries. When Disney is a major employer in the entertainment industry, you as a critic, you as, you know, a director, as a producer, as an actor, have the incentive to say their films are really great and you would really like to work with them and collaborate in the future. And that means that to the extent it is non-anonymous, you are scared of that ruining your reputation in their eyes, being a scar against you on the grand stage. But secondly, you don't want to piss off the fans. And second, like, affirmative is like, oh, there aren't that many fans. There are so many Marvel fans out there that are going to read through every single step of your unanonymized like justification for why their film was worse, and they're going to tear you apart because of that. They are going to call you things like racist or sexist or whatever else and try and find things to throw against you, find reasons why your justification doesn't hold up. But additionally, I think the people are likely to opt out, and the best people are likely to opt out because they provide being able to opt out as like a mechanism, as like a good thing. I just don't think it is. I think the people who are likely to opt out are people who are underconfident in their opinions, are ones who don't, you know, want to have to go through this torment, who are ones who probably are, you know, have more indie views, who are less in the mainstream, who potentially have had less successful careers and stuff like that. So they're less likely to want to engage in the first place because they're more scared of getting all of this backlash. I think that means that the boards are incredibly unrepresentative, more biased than they are currently, and again, they don't even justify why they would ever be less biased under their side. I guess the other response here is that justification is so good, like it's really good that people have to justify their decisions and can't kind of make arbitrary things. I think the first thing to say is a lot of this is stuff that is just really hard to justify, as in why a movie connects with you. And no, this is something they tell you. It's really subjective. People have really individual music and film taste, and that is something that is incredibly hard to put into words or into a report. And that means that people are likely to try and pick safe options or err on the side of things like reputation, on like picking actors who are very popular in the main stage and in the main eye. They're more likely to that way into their decision, in part because of the public pressures I've already explained to you, but also because when they sit down to write a report, it is really hard to say this film just like sat with me in a way that like, you know, changed my life. Instead, you have to point to things like lighting that are really tangible, to things like a cohesive narrative and storyline and stuff like that. So again, people are less likely to point to the things that this team, and we agree, make art and are more likely to do it under other things. But again, I think these reports are likely to be poured over. I think it is probably untrue that the general public, I think the general public is probably more racist and sexist than a lot of people in these instances, and are likely to, you know, use these reports, you know, not as a way of holding these people accountable, but as a way of saying, why on earth would you give this to, at this actor who is, an old woman who isn't someone I personally, am attracted to or whatever, instead of this really cool actor, instead of like Tom Holland, who I love and am obsessed with. I think obviously film critics are in a much better position to be making that decision, a much more, agreeable. I don't think that making them provide a justification, I think, leads just to worse decisions, but also the accountability is likely to go in the wrong way and not in a productive way. Why is the status quo good? The first thing to say is I think that empirically it just kind of is. Like, cool films are nominated, places like the Oscars and like the Grammys have a lot of cool indie artists who are given a platform there. We point to Everything Everywhere All at Once winning the last Oscars. That, was like good and great and probably a good decision, one that shows that these boards aren't completely biased and unrepresentative. But additionally, we point to incentives of the people organising these things. We tell you that they want to make entertaining shows, which means they need things people haven't seen. You don't want to go to the Oscars and just see all the trailers of the movies you already know about it. You don't want to go and just have it be things like Marvel and things you don't really care about. But additionally, they have incentives for boards to be representative. They have to stand behind being entirely transparent. I think we could still probably support things like making sure there's some sort of affirmative action so you have representation on these boards to some degree. I think that's entirely plausible as well, and we can get that. And something that is probably increasingly happening as the industry becomes more accepting and inclusive. I think that it's pretty good under status quo. There's no need to shift it up. Let's then talk about competition, which I think is where they clearly lose the debate. Noting that I don't think they have any real calm standing of this system. There is not bias, or there is more under their side, all of that kind of stuff. And that's what we tell you. We point out that currently there is a positive trend under the Biden of breaking up media monopolies and ensuring that there are less massive mergers and stuff like that. And this is something that we have to monopolize on when we have the chance. Because we point to you that their first response is to say it's hard to monopolize. Obviously it is not. I point to Disney. It's incredibly easy to have monopolies in the entertainment industry. But secondly, they tell us that new art will rise anyway. There's an incentive for it. But no, we tell you very clearly that these sort of award shows are a unique avenue for new art to be imported into places that doesn't exist otherwise. And that's because it is one of the few ways in an era of streaming services for small movies to get through, because otherwise they are never going to be put on things like Netflix where people watch their films. They're never going to be put at the cinemas in people's areas or given the good times or advertised in the way that a company like Disney can advertise their films. And so it's actually incredibly unclear why they are able to break through all of that messaging when people are relatively content just watching another, especially when Disney movies just have more money, so they probably are visually and musically more appealing, and so more people are likely to listen to them. Why then is this awful for competition? It is awful because it allows these big companies to gamify it more, to fall over these reports and or in the worst case, these numerical instances, and point to what these companies want, and then implement that in their movies or do things about it to knock down competition who is doing that well, to not allow them onto their streaming services and stuff like that, to get rid of them wherever possible, or to go, everyone in this board that they really valued things like great music, we're going to invest really heavily in music. And then when they don't give us the award, we're going to call them out for being, unreliable and biased, so we can read their report and see that they are changing and stuff like that. I think that is incredibly awful. It gives power to the ones with the most money and the most resources to pour over these things. It allows for no monopolization. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the second negative speaker for that speech, and whenever the speaker is ready, the affirmative.
Good to go?
Whenever you're ready.
Great. I'd like to return everyone to the film that's mentioned in Anna's introduction, which is Spike Lee's Malcolm X. Comes out in the early 90s. It is now widely regarded by many people who care about film, many film critics, as not only one of the finest films ever made, not only one of the great civil rights films, but has some genuinely incredible filmmaking. Denzel Washington's performance there is one of the best lead male performances ever in kind of contemporary, or definitely in the most modern filmmaking, and it received not a single nomination. What are today's films like that? What are films that in time will come to properly appreciate and understand were great? And how will we know? How will we be able to sort through why they weren't chosen at that time, what that tells us about where society is? All that information is denied for us, because we never know why, and I think we have some good reasons to suspect, the Oscars at the time didn't select a black film starring with a charismatic black lead made by an incredible black director about one of the central civil rights figures. I think we have a few reasons to believe they might have been having a little bit of racial bias there, but with the films we have today, the films that might genuinely be incredibly important, might actually be saying something important maybe not everyone paid attention to, we don't know why they weren't nominated, or if they were nominated, why they didn't win. We have no idea who the runner-up is in any given year for a particular award. That's information we get. Because our model is just simply getting the people who vote on this stuff to publish the films that they themselves personally voted for, and then for everyone to understand the algorithm through which they took people's lists for who they thought should win, and then turn that into the winners that are announced on the night. Because right now, we don't know that. And that is crazy, given the importance of these awards for individual people in the film industry, for whom a sound editor gets a nomination, they can immediately start charging more, which after years of exploitation, and often an industry that underpays its technical staff, is a pretty big win for them, and they should have a right to know about how that process is doled out, given it's enormously important, but also, as I've hinted at, for society writ large. First I'm going to do is talk about a brief example that they use that I think they abuse. Then I'll explain our comparative and why it's better and why specifically second negative willfully misinterprets it. Then I'll explain the kind of two other miscellaneous harms they had about these awards becoming gamified and the fact that the awards decision-making process should be ratings optimized to try and encourage better ratings. Onto this example, they use everything everywhere all at once as the kind of a big plus for their side as an example as to why, see, the Oscars are actually diverse, they're actually rewarding indie films, etc. One, this was one of the most commercially successful films of the year, so that is an untrue characterization. Two, it's like, in terms of filmmaking, it's building off the most dominant cultural force in filmmaking, modern American filmmaking, which is the Marvel films. They're doing the multiverse thing. But two, even if that's true, it's just not good enough. Like, we should know which film came second in the set of the films that were nominated for Best Picture. We should be able to know that. And three, I actually think this is an argument for our side, because that film had a tremendous amount of popular support. In the Entertainment Weekly article, they asked the people why they voted for Everything Everywhere All at Once, which several of the anonymous Academy members did. And they're like, I don't know, it seems like the film everyone wanted to win, so I picked it. Like, that's not good enough. And the fact that we should instead have lots of people be forced to justify and explain how they did that. What's the beauty of our case? Our case just tells you how these people are selected. You get named a member of the Academy when you're just kind of a high rep person in the film industry. Then you participate in the voting process. No one checks to see if you've actually voted on the films, and you never have to explain yourself or justify yourself. Imagine if debating was something like that. Crazy, right? Then, we explain there are 6 implications. It means 1, these people often nominate films that just to satisfy personal beefs or people who they like. They reward Russell Crowe with an Oscar several years after he was nominated for an Oscar, which he probably should have won but didn't. They felt like they had to correct for that. 2, they often, because they are older, because it takes time to build a reputation, just more likely to be white and more conservative. 3, they get swept up in trends. They're just not particularly necessarily the smartest people in the world, frankly. 4, they often don't pay attention and don't watch the films because no one expects them to and they never have to explain themselves. And 5, they often don't know about the particular categories they're running for. And 6, often they're just random and have strange thoughts about films and they never have to justify them. All we say is, for each individual voter, they have to tell us the films they voted for so that people can ask them about why they voted for them and not something else. That's all our model is. Second negative is like, it's this complicated process, it'll be so logistically difficult. No, you just do what the BFI does every year, every 10 years. We would just do it every year for one of these award shows. So they just get the list and then have the way in which the algorithm they use to sort through everyone's lists to arrive at the final decision, have that also be public so people can scrutinize that and if need be, change it. That's our model, that's all it is. It requires no further analysis from that. It's quite simple. Their big push here is like, once it's anonymous, because it's anonymous, Academy voters are like brave truth tellers who are, unintimidated by fans, unintimidated by corporate control, etc. And they're like, the opt-out means you lose all these brave, sort of single-minded individuals. We would say a couple of things. One, to the extent that someone is making controversial picks, that actually offers social incentives to be quite contrarian, which you may have noticed online. There are social incentives, especially in the BFI poll, for example, to pick strange films that make you seem like interesting, someone with real refined taste, right? But we'd also point to the fact that anonymity in this case is just an explanation, is not so much like guarantees that someone can never be pressured, because they can already be sweet talked by companies, and they currently are, and I'll get to that a little later, but it just means that they never have to explain or justify themselves. They never even have to prove that they actually watched any of the films. It's honestly sort of shockingly bad, this particular, the way in which these awards are doled out. They're often done in extremely bad fashion. Case in point, Bohemian Rhapsody, one of the worst edited films I've ever seen, one of the best editing, because I think, because the Academy felt like Bohemian Rhapsody had to rule some Oscars, but didn't want to give them for the categories they probably actually deserved an Oscar in, and had to sort of find another category, and ended up screwing over some poor editor who probably deserved it elsewhere. Then their final push is, the general public, who we want to be able to scrutinize this process, is more sexist and racist than the Academy. I'm sorry, literally only 3 years after the #OscarsSoWhite campaign, I think this argument is just laughable. These people are old, they are white, they are old film producers who grew up in the 60s and 70s. I think social media is far better, just statistically filled with far more younger, more liberal people. They can hold them to account. That's what we're interested in. So, I think it's clear the process of selecting these films is far more accountable under our side. Given those awards are important, that's just a massive benefit for our side, because we just clearly win. We stack up the we win. I'm going to stack up the margin, because they say, oh, well, the reason why it's this way is because we care about ratings for these shows, and that's a good thing. A very clever point. There are 4 problems, though. 1, Academy members don't make money, so they actually have no incentive to care about the ratings of the shows too much beyond the fact that they're Academy and they vaguely care about the prestige. 2, the poor ratings for the show are better explained by their length and the fact they got Jimmy Kimmel, who's not a very good host. Like, it's not the case that it is the surprise there. But 2, art is just very surprising. It is like totally and quite subjective, as they tell you. It's quite likely, even with our process. And remember, the list would probably only be announced after they actually have the awards night and everyone justifies their films they're voting for afterwards. That's like fine, like it's still going to be surprising, people will still want to tune in, but also just doesn't weigh out properly. Like, not sure why the Oscars getting more ratings is necessarily more beneficial than like people actually having to be accountable for decisions that do impact the lives of other people to a great extent. The better stuff though is on corporate consolidation. I think there's a problem here though, it's quite imprecise. Many films make a lot of money, like Transformers did. Never won an Oscar. There's a very simple reason that it's not one of the prestige-coded films that Oscar voters cared about. Also, by the way, the streaming numbers are proprietary property of the streaming companies, which means they wouldn't be able to use those numbers to justify it. And Jess also points out there's actually antitrust law which makes consolidation less likely over time, but it's also symmetric. Like Andrew Reesborough currently conducted a sort of stealth campaign to try and get herself best Oscar. Companies, famously production companies have done like sweet talk to try and target members and make sure that their campaign is the one that's really notable. Under our side, at least it's clear, at least it's more obvious, at least you can point it out and say, oh, it's strange, you all went to this one dinner and then you all voted for the, like, we know that now. We didn't know on their side. Obviously, transparency is a win. But actually, I'm just not sure that you can gamify these awards, because remember, we're just publishing what they voted for and then publishing the algorithm by which they decided to vote for it. Like, maybe you can try and build a gamify around that. We point to 1 that maybe creates worse films. This analysis suggests about how if you focus on trying to optimize for some metrics, you just create a strange, unwatchable AI-produced product. But 2, to the extent that does happen, obviously social media and backlash over time can force people to change the algorithm or change the way we do it, such that things don't get gamified. Because people don't want awards to be given out to like random companies or to people who don't deserve it. People would like a fair process, which is precisely why you should vote out.
I'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker and the affirmative team for their case, and whenever they're ready, third negative.
The more that this team says that they want these awards to conform more to mainstream opinions, which is fundamentally the crux of all of their material about why public accountability is good, the less that they have any meaning to these awards and the less that they achieve anything of value in this industry. Because the more that they're able to suggest that the Oscars just looks the same as who is topping the box office, or who is doing best commercially, or who is winning the hearts and minds of upper middle class America, the less that these awards have any value, the more that you can glean this information in a bunch of other ways. What we explain to you is that the purpose of these awards is not to be objective. It is not to recognize what is the empirically best film. If you care about that, look to the market. That probably does tell you what is the empirically best film by that team's own metric. You already get the information. The point of these awards is, in fact, what we tell you it is. It is a marketing tool that gives underground or unknown indie studios like A24 up until literally this year, which was indie, which was underground, like things like foreign competition, films like Parasite, like recognizing Bollywood films like Triple R for having the best sound, for having the best song. All of that is what these awards do. They pick things that are high quality or at least interesting. They give them a platform that they otherwise would not have. That is their utility, that is their value, and we explained that this team would do away with that entirely and just make this the same as the Rotten Tomatoes ranking, and at that point, I don't know what they actually achieve in terms of changing culture, in terms of achieving any sort of benefit for society, beyond having maybe an awards show that is kind of like technically more meritocratic. Who cares? They don't explain why that matters at all. Let's talk firstly about the context that this debate takes place in, then about the benefits of the status quo, and lastly about whether or not there are in fact problems and how we outweigh them. Firstly, on the context. The important thing to understand here is that we explained to you that monopolization has already largely occurred in these industries. Like, antitrust law was not enough to stop Disney from buying Times Warner, Warner Brothers, Fox, Star, Miramax. Like, they're buying cinemas around the country in the US as well. Disney has this insane monopoly. Sony similarly dominates music and production. What we explained to you is that in Gypsy's speech, we identify that the change of administration in the US means that antitrust laws are increasingly being enforced, which means that further monopolization is unlikely to occur. This is a unique time where you can use these award shows, and increasingly these award shows are being used as a vehicle to further competition by elevating an upstart studio like A24, which won not just incidentally with the hugely commercially successful Everywhere All at Once, but also won awards for After Sun, a movie that probably most people in this room have not heard about, which also is getting attention for things like Pearl and Maxine and XXX. Like, all of that is extraordinarily valuable, which means that what they're able to do is bring in competition both from domestic sources like A24, but also to elevate things like foreign films like Parasite or RRR, which is also really, or art house stuff, like sometimes Quentin Tarantino movies get up in this way. Like, all of this is extremely valuable, because importantly, Brendan suggests, oh, well, everyone already knows about these things anyway, but that's because Brendan's on Twitter all the time. The ordinary middle American actually doesn't get everything everywhere all at once. Like, if you talk to somebody over the age of 40 who's white, often they'll sort of say, oh, I found the dildo scene quite confusing, and I didn't really get the whole thing. But the point of these award shows is that they bring these to those mainstream audiences, they get them interested, and they go and watch them even if they don't understand them. That is the key difference in this debate, and is what takes something from being like a success in the art world, or a success in like upper middle America, to being a more mainstream hit, which gives these studios the funding that they need to be a credible competitor to the monopolies that we tell you exist, and that could be combated under our side. They do away with that the more that they suggest they would no longer be giving out awards to those types of media, which might be polarizing, which might not yet be mainstream hits, and would instead just give them to like John Wick 4 or whatever. Like, that is an incredibly disappointing thing for them to say, and means that their model just does not have an additive value to the culture or to the market. It is likely to be highly reflective of existing statistical measures that people can already access, and it gives scope to people that already have power, like Disney and like Sony, to, at the point where the anonymity is removed, which is what we say is one of the key harms of their model, to do things like influence those people by blackballing them from an incredibly monopolized market and saying that they won't employ them anymore, or by doing things like trying to buy them off, trying to install their own employees, trying to push to change it and make it more reliant on things like empirical metrics, which, because they have control over things like production and distribution and marketing of this media, they can easily manipulate, for instance, by preferencing their own films on the opening weekend, if that's the statistic, or by preferencing them over a longer period of time if it's total returns that is being measured. All of that allows them to easily use this to stomp out the ability of those award shows to do what they have a revealed and empirical preference for doing, which is rewarding upstart and competitive forms of media. Incredibly destructive. Which is why they do away with the key benefit that these awards actually provide under the status quo. And note that we give you a series of explanations as to why competition in the media marketplace is the foremost benefit in this debate. We explain that without that competition, you get far worse conditions for employees in the entertainment market. That is millions of people. Like, that's VFX workers in India who are working on Marvel films. That's incredibly important for things like actors for disadvantaged backgrounds who are now able to choose between different studios to be employed. It's important for older actors from diverse backgrounds like Michelle Yeoh, who would have never been cast as a protagonist in a Marvel film, but got to be cast as a protagonist in an A24 film. All of this means that on our side, we have better, more representative, more competitive media that pays its staff better, because those staff have more choices over where to work for, increasingly, like now and more into the future on our side. But also, we're able to push back against things like majoritarian culture. We're able to have interesting films that have a more Eastern-focused philosophy, instead of just watching, Cape shit every single weekend. Obviously, extremely beneficial to Western culture and to everyone's media appetite as well, in a general sense, if you care about that. Let's then talk about what the problems are that they identify. I think they are extraordinarily low impact by comparison to the material we give you. The first thing is that I guess we get this material in Brendan's speech largely, but also, of course, earlier in the debate, around how, we don't understand how these guys are making their decisions. Like, who cares? Like, we often don't understand why judges make the decisions that they make in courts. We often don't understand the detailed reasons why politicians vote for the laws that they vote for. But we trust these people and these institutions to make decisions that are overall good for the culture. And I would suggest that the Grammys and the Oscars and the Tonys do consistently make decisions that are overall good for improving competitiveness, for giving people a more varied media diet. It seems like there is not really a problem. And I'm not sure what the knowledge of who the runner-up to Everything Everywhere All at Once would would do for anybody or would do for society, what that actually matters. Like, do people go out and watch the runner-up? I don't think they do. I think they watch the winner. It's just unclear why this really matters. But also, when it comes to knowledge of problems, like, guys, like, we all know why American History X did not win the Grammys in the 90s. It's because of racism. Like, and I guess that's kind of an unnuanced response or whatever, but we have enough knowledge to do things like push for these boards to recognize more diverse films, which has empirically happened. Like, social media, status quo exists symmetrically and already pushes these institutions to look further afield, to be more interesting in the things that they nominate, to be more diverse. Which means that, really, when it comes to pressuring them to make better decisions, that's fine and is actually better done under our side when the consequence of making a more interesting decision, of picking an indie film over a Disney film, does not get you blackballed from industry or threatened by Marvel executives. So it's far easier, actually, to fulfill what social media and the blue check marks want you to do on our side of the house, or at least to make more interesting decisions, at least to make more pro-competitive decisions or non-mainstream choices, which we tell you is the fundamental benefit. The second thing, then, is that they have a problem with who these selectors are. Well, all of this is speculative anyway, because we literally do not know, so I suggest that this should be heavily de-weighted in the debate. But the second thing to say is that their alternative, if you believe they have fiat in this debate to definitely get away with what they want to, why is a critic better than somebody who makes the film? Like, they don't actually do any sort of comparative analysis here. Maybe their critics are on average 3 or 4 years younger. Maybe they're on average slightly more diverse. The impacts here are non-existent, and they don't explain them anyway. An extraordinarily marginal and dubious benefit compared to what we provide you on the status quo. Proud to be negative.
Awesome. We'd like to thank the third negative speaker and your teams for a great debate. Across the floor, shake hands, and then DC.
Oh, it's in the seats, wait, guys. Oh, no, it's right there.
Next round.
I realized I like accidentally absorbed a fair bit of.
Cool. So first of all, I wanted to thank teams on what was a really, really great debate. 3 parts to this oral adjudication. Firstly, on general feedback, then who won the debate, and then the breakdown of the debate itself. The first thing I'll say, though, is I had a really great discussion with my panel, so feel free to approach them for feedback as well. All of our feedback and all of our thoughts have been integrated into this OA. So firstly, on general feedback. Quite a good debate, very high quality. Let's get into some more constructive stuff then. I think the first thing to say is, at times this debate, in terms of setup, was incredibly confusing for a lot of the panel. For the simple fact that I think that it was illustrated like through example what this model was likely to look like. And this applies to both characterizations from affirmative and negative. First in like the setup as to what it was likely to look like, and then sort of the more nitty-gritty like detailed explanation of like the functioning of this panel or the functioning of the award decision makers themselves. I think what would be useful along with these examples is to kind of delve into like the reasoning why you think that example was likely and directly compare that in setup to your opposition as well. Obviously you do not have like the oracle, you do not know exactly what like people later in the debate are going to think or going to conceptualize, but you can kind of guess likely alternates and try to do that comparative way off as early as you can possibly in the debate, particularly when you think there are going to be like definitional clashes or clashes on kind of like basic issues of setup. For instance, like what this board looks like and the decision-making process, incredibly important that gets determined early on to have as clean a debate as possible. I think the second thing to say is at times there is like a lack of specific comparative in terms of responses. Again, it is like, you know, sometimes difficult to predict all material that would come out in that debate itself. But when you are giving examples or when you are giving reasons why things were true or why your side either had like a better outcome than the opposition, it is then an easy thing to do to kind of like add in just a line of analysis as to why this was always going to be preferable to the world that your opposition had, whether or not they were defending the status quo or like the new model that was going to like or like the new practice that was going to be included. So making sure that in debates that are likely to be very good, making sure that you have more of that direct comparative there to make it far easier to delineate and distinguish issues when they get really, really close and when there's a lack of clear setup. And I think the last thing to say is examples in this debate were very good, as they tend to be in pop culture rounds as well. Try to have a greater diversity of these examples, but also clarity in these examples. So rather than just like throwing out an example that is like probably relevant to the topic, making sure that you explain specifically how that links to the argument that you're making, and then how that sort of influences the wider map of the debate. Particularly when examples are good and valuable, you want to maximize optimize them to the best of their ability. And in debates about pop culture, you probably have a very nice pool to draw from. So you should be able to find ones that are definitely applicable. But overall, a really, really great debate from both teams. Now we're going to get into the decision for this debate. We thought that it was a very good debate. It was quite close, but we've given this debate to the negative, and we're going to explain those reasons now. So firstly, on the quality of the award, the awards themselves. So 2 questions. Firstly, on how the quality of the award allocations kind of happened or went down, and then secondly, what is the impact on the industry itself? So this encompasses issues of the market and the monopolization of those industries themselves. Let's talk about the quality of the awards themselves, and this is where a lot of the debate takes place. So it's quite an important issue for the simple fact that teams probably spent a lot of time on it, and there was some varying analysis as to why these were important to individuals, but also just the art form itself. 2 things that are kind of agreed upon by the end of the debate by teams that mattered on this issue. Firstly, that media was better at least at representing individuals, both on a diversity basis, but also the opinions of that academy themselves. And then the second thing to say is recognition of the art form itself. So on this, which model of decision making ensures that these 2 issues are met? Let's talk about what affirmative presents. We think that early on in the debate, they do a pretty good job of setup. And that is to say, this is quite simple. Individuals are going to have to justify their opinions. This is good for people who are going to watch this, and people can then ask these individuals questions. There is more of a pressure or onus on them to justify their reasoning. And this was important because this had a huge importance to individuals. So for instance, their jobs, their income, but also just their art and their passion was attached to this, and therefore it had the weight of transparency that would be useful. On the diversity of opinions, what does affirmative tell us? Later on, they also tell us that people are likely to have better or more diverse opinions in this format because there are social incentives to be contrarian, but also these individuals are probably going to display their refined takes as well. This preempts some of Negative's material, but what we think affirmative's stronger material on this is that this was going to there were going to be large employers that would still hire these people. There was going to be a sufficient amount of fan accountability that was going to aid these individuals as well. Here's the reason that we thought that this was unconvincing when compared to a lot of Negative's material about how there would be negative personal consequences for these individuals, was we bought into that material as to why people who were likely going to have good creative opinions or people that were particularly diverse were more likely to opt out because of the greater influence of that market pressure, which we'll talk about later, but also the increased amount of accountability and scrutiny on those individuals was probably going to be something that was difficult for them to contend with, and it was likely that these forums were going to be more biased than they were currently because very good individuals were likely to opt out of these systems. The second thing to say is on the idea of subjective metrics. At the end of this, we thought that it was likely that subjective metrics probably did encompass the model in the way in which this would be practiced in both teams. That is to say, I thought reputation pressures and who was in these movies probably had an incredible bearing on the outcomes of these awards in both worlds. But the reason that we found it was more likely in the world of side affirmative was for the simple reason that when these decisions were popular or when they were ones that were kind of commercially accepted, it was likely that individuals were going to rely on biases. For instance, their reputation or who was in those films to make the basis of those decisions because they are likely to be seen as uncontroversial. This is particularly important when we weigh that against material as to people likely did not watch these movies or they did not have a particular interest. We think they're more likely to rely on these biases. And at the end, even if these biases played into both worlds, which we kind of accepted in this debate, we thought that it was far more likely when these individuals had a degree of scrutiny, it was kind of unclear beyond just having the onus to justify their decision, why they were unlikely to fall into these bias traps like they already did. That was compounded when we believed that people were likely to opt out of these decisions, even in light of affirmative analysis as to why they were, why this transparency was good. At the end of this, side negative is also able to further make ground because I thought that oftentimes it was difficult for these individuals to have their opinion unimpeded when the biases that they had were likely going to impact their employment prospects as well. I thought that it meant it was a more difficult space for these individuals to have their transparent opinion come forward, and the issue of transparency in that debate, in this, falls to side negative. Lastly, on the efficiency of this panel in general, on this first issue, I think that this was an incredibly kind of like small part of the debate because it was like at times vaguely set up and speculative from both teams as well. I think that this would have been aided by just like, you know, better punctuated examples throughout, particularly like early on in the debate as to how this would operate. I think it is plausible that it falls to like a Democratic vote, but I also think that it is like, you know, well, like I think affirmative sets up that it is probably possible that, you know there is some configuration of how these decisions are made are worked out. At the end of this debate, though, at the end of this issue, though, I thought that despite the historical wrongs that had happened, I thought that it was probably worse off for the transparency of these award systems, but also the integrity of those individuals' decision to have them be like named and shamed and held directly accountable for those opinions, particularly when the benefit of that transparency is quite speculative in the debate, and I'm unclear of the quality of that output in light of material about competitive pressures. So let's actually talk about those competitive pressures, because we thought that this was an area of the debate where side negative was able to make a lot of ground, but there was really great engagement from both teams throughout the debate, which we thought was really nice. We hear from side negative about media monopoly, so for instance like Disney, and that these were particularly harmful for a couple of reasons, because like the decision-making process every single year gave them kind of like a gamified like how-to guide of how to make a movie that was like viable for these awards. Kind of like a playbook, but I think the more convincing material we get from the negative team is that this allows studios that have already monopolized or have already consolidated to kind of throw their weight around to like impact which studios release things when, and the ability for those studios to market to the individuals that are on this panel as well. On this, we thought that affirmative has good responses and that antitrust laws already exist, and that there was going to be like increasing scrutiny, and there was also increasing popularity of smaller directing houses or directors or like foreign and independent films. The issue here is the understanding in the debate about why this is important to individuals' careers, because, you know, awards were good. They meant, you know, people were likely to get higher salaries. They were likely to get more recognition. Compounds some of the harms that side negative is able to outline about why these awards were important, particularly to people on these panels as well. Because at the point that we thought that people were more likely to be subject to harms from these large media organizations, they were more likely to want to like please them. They were more likely to change their opinions to fit in with, to like appease these larger groups. We thought that that was the point when this was made transparent, when those people were under the most intense scrutiny from those organizations that had a huge impact, that like admittedly throughout the debate had a huge impact on both their reputation, but also their livelihood and their income. And so we thought that increased the pressure on committee members themselves and increased large studios' influence over these awards and how they went year after year. So the end of what was again a very, very close and high quality debate. Again, we've awarded it to the negative, but great job both teams.